They called them her screaming gray rats, and they said it to her face at the Ferris feed store the morning she came in for cracked corn, the whole counter of men grinning while Dell Rourke asked, loud enough for the back of the store, whether Marian Hollis had finally decided to wring all 84 of the ugly things and buy herself one decent heifer like a person with sense. The room laughed. Marian set her money on the counter and said she believed she would keep the birds a while longer, and she carried her sack out to the truck with her back straight and her ears burning, and behind her the laughter had that particular ring countryman keep for a widow who will not take good advice. She was 42 years old that summer, the summer of 1976. And she had been a widow for 3 of those years, and she farmed a hardscrabble quarter section down in the low end of the Coldwater Valley, where the ground was thin and the brush crept in along every fence row, and the good families up on the bench had always privately agreed that a woman alone could not hold it. Tom Hollis had died in the spring of a heart that quit him in the seat of his own tractor, and after the funeral, the valley had been kind to Marian in the way people are kind about a place they are quietly certain will be for sale inside 2 years. They brought casseroles. They mentioned gently that Dell Rourke was always looking to add ground, and that there was no shame in a fair price. Marian thanked them for the food, and she did not sell, and within a year she had done the thing that turned the valley's pity into open ridicule. She had gone over the ridge into the next valley and come home with 84 Guinea hens. The birds had a reputation, and the reputation was that they were worthless. Everyone in the Coldwater Valley knew what a guinea fowl was and what a guinea fowl was good for, which was to say nothing. They were ugly, hunched, small-headed gray birds, speckled all over with white, like someone had flicked whitewash off a brush, and they laid a small, hard, thick-shelled egg that no one much wanted, and they dressed out to almost no meat, and, worst of all, past every other sin, they screamed. A guinea flock did not cluck or cackle the comfortable barnyard way a hen did. It screamed a harsh, 2-note, metallic racket. Buckwheat, 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 over and over, at a hawk's shadow, at a blowing leaf, at a truck a mile off on the county road, at nothing at all. The men at the feed store agreed that if the good Lord had set out to design the single most useless creature a farmer could keep, he could not have improved on a guinea hen, and that only a woman gone soft with grief would fill a whole quarter section with the shrieking things. Marian Hollis was not, by the reckoning of the men on the feed store stools, the sort of person anyone expected to know better. She was a spare, weathered woman with sun lines at her eyes and graying brown hair she kept tucked up under a man's brown felt hat, quiet by nature and quieter since Tom died. And she had never in her life been one to argue a point at a counter. She kept to her place. She did her own fencing and her own haying and ran a small mixed herd and a garden that fed her through the winter, and she read the almanac, the extension bulletins, the old hand-written ledgers Tom's father had kept, and she trusted a thing she had watched with her own eyes over a thing a room full of men agreed was true. That habit was about to make her the most laughed-at woman in the county, and then, though not one of the men grinning at the feed store that morning would have believed it, the one they all came to. What none of them troubled to ask was why. Not one man at that counter, in all the weeks of easy laughter, ever thought to ask Marian Hollis why a careful woman who counted every dollar and would not waste a nail would go out of her way to acquire 84 birds that everyone knew were good for nothing. They did not ask because they were certain they already knew the answer, and the answer was that grief had made her foolish. But Marian had a reason. And the reason was a thing she had watched happen years before on this very ground with her own 2 eyes. It had been Tom who first brought the guineas home, back before he died, a dozen of them, off a Cherokee-blooded farmhand named Elias Redbird, who had worked a season for them in the drought years and who had told Tom, in the flat certain way of a man passing on something his own grandmother had taught him, that if a man wanted ticks gone off his ground, he ran guineas on it. And no other thing on earth worked half so well. Tom had laughed at first, too, but Elias had been right. That summer, and every summer after, the dozen guineas had worked the fence rows and the brush lines of the Hollis place in a tight patrolling flock from first light to dark, and Marian had watched, over the years, a thing so plain she could not understand how the rest of the valley had never seen it. The ground the guineas patrolled had no ticks. Where the birds worked, the grass was clean. She had pulled ticks off the valley's cattle at every branding, and off her own arms every time she walked another man's brush, and off her own ground, where the gray birds screamed and patrolled, she pulled none. She had not read it in a book. She had watched it for 6 years. She remembered the way Elias had said it, because he had not said it the way a man sells you a thing. He had said it the way a man tells you the plain shape of the world and does not much care whether you believe him. They had been sitting out the noon heat in the shade of the machine shed, the 3 of them, and Tom had been complaining about the ticks the way every man in the valley complained about the ticks, as a fixed and hopeless fact of living, like the wind. And Elias had looked up from the harness he was mending and said, quiet, that his grandmother had kept guineas her whole life and never pulled a tick off a soul, and that where he came from a man who wanted his ground clean, did not fight the ticks one at a time with his fingers and a jar of kerosene. He turned loose the birds the good Lord had made to eat them and let them do the work they were made for. Tom had asked, half laughing, whether he meant to say a flock of guinea hens could do what dips and dusts and burning off the fence rows could not, and Elias had said he did not mean to say it, he meant it was so, and that Tom could believe it or pull ticks the rest of his life. It was all one to him. There had been no heat in it. It was the certainty of a man who has watched a thing be true so long that other men's doubt has stopped being interesting. And when Elias moved on at the end of the season, the dozen guineas he had talked Tom into stayed, and did exactly what he had said they would do, and Marian never forgot the flat, sure sound of a man passing on a thing worth more than he was ever paid for. So it was not, whatever the valley believed, a thing Marian had dreamed up out of grief. It was a thing she had inherited twice over, once from a quiet farmhand's grandmother by way of a noon conversation in the shade, and once from 6 summers of walking her own fence rows and finding them clean while every other fence row in the valley crawled. She had tested it the way she tested everything, not by arguing it, but by watching it, year on year, until the watching left no room for doubt. She knew which of her neighbors' children came home from the ditches speckled with ticks, and which of their dogs she had seen a man burn a tick off of on the co-op steps, and she knew that on her own thin, brush-crept ground, the ground the valley pitied, a body could walk the worst of the grass in July and come back clean. A dozen birds had done that on the Hollis place for 6 years. She had 84 now. She did not need a book or a bulletin or a single man's blessing to know what 84 would do, and she did not much care that the valley thought her a fool for knowing it, because she had learned long since that being thought a fool by people who have not watched what you have watched is a cheap enough price for being right. So when the family over the ridge went broke and quit their farm and had 84 guineas they could not carry with them and could not give away, Marian Hollis did the thing that made the valley certain she had lost her mind. She took the whole flock for a few dollars and a promise to haul off some scrap besides, and she brought them home in slat crates in the back of the truck, 84 screaming gray birds, and she turned them loose on her thin brush-crept quarter section to do the one job on earth a guinea does better than any creature living. She was not keeping pets. She was not soft with grief. She was, quietly and on purpose, cleaning her ground of ticks in the only way she had ever seen work, and she was doing it with an army the rest of the valley would have paid to be rid of. The day she went for them stayed with her, in the plain way a hard day stays with a person who has known a few. The oldest place over the ridge in the next valley had failed the slow-way farms fail. A wet year and a dry one and a note called at the bank, and by the time Marian drove her truck up the rutted lane the family was already half loaded out, a mattress roped to a trailer, and a woman standing in the yard with her arms folded, watching a life come apart. The guineas were the last thing they could not solve. Nobody would buy them, and nobody would take them, and you could not. The man said, standing there with his hat off, "Hardly bring yourself to turn 80-some birds out to starve or to the coyotes," but he could not carry them where he was going either. Marian looked at the flock working the weeds along the failed man's fence, quick and tireless even then, even on a place that was dying around them. And she named a few dollars she could spare and said she'd haul off the scrap iron by the shed besides, so he'd not have to. The man took the money and looked at it in his hand and said she was doing him a kindness. And Marian said the birds were doing her one, which the man plainly took for pity, dressed up gentle, and let pass. She backed the crates up and loaded them in the failing afternoon light, 84 birds screaming the whole while, and drove them home over the ridge, and she did not tell the man, because there was no point and no unkindness in her, that she reckoned she was driving off with the most useful thing on his whole ruined place. The valley found out, because valleys always find out, and the valley laughed. Word went round the feed store and the church steps and the co-op scale within a week that the Hollis widow had gone and brought home better than 80 of the screaming things, a whole quarter section of them now, and the county settled in to enjoy it. They could hear the birds from the county road, they said, that awful racket carrying half a mile on a still morning, and they pitied her nearest neighbors, and they marveled that a grown woman would do such a thing on purpose. Dell Rourke, who ran 400 head on the good bench ground above her and ran the valley's opinions besides, allowed to the whole feed store that he'd offered the widow a fair price for that ground twice over and been turned down flat, and that now she'd filled it with shrieking gray vermin, and that he supposed a person got the farm they deserved. The men laughed. Not one of them asked the only question that mattered, which was what a woman who had watched a flock of guineas clean the ticks off her ground for 6 straight years might know that a room full of men who had never watched anything of the kind did not. The mockery had a face, and the face was the feed store, and Marian met it the only way she knew, which was to go in for what she needed and come out again without giving them the satisfaction of an argument. She heard it stop when the bell over the door rang and start again lower, the way talk does when its subject walks in. One of the older men turned on his stool that first week and asked her, for the pleasure of the room, whether she was raising them birds for the singing or the eating, because he couldn't figure which they were worse at. The room laughed. Marian said she was raising them for neither, and left it there and paid for her wire and went out. And behind her the laughter had a slightly puzzled edge under it that it had not had going in. Because a person who will not defend a foolish thing is harder to laugh at than a person who will. She had learned in 3 years of being a widow the valley expected to fail that there is a particular loneliness in being the only one on a place who knows what the place needs. She did not enjoy it. She had simply stopped expecting company in it. She let them laugh, because she had learned that a laughing valley is a valley that leaves you be, and being left be was most of what she wanted. And while they laughed, she worked, and the birds worked with her. Through the early summer of 1976, the 84 guineas settled onto the Hollis quarter section and did what guineas do, which was to spread out across the ground in a loose, bristling flock and hunt. They worked the fence rows where the grass grew tall and the ticks waited. They worked the brush lines along the coulee where the deer bedded and the deer brought ticks. They worked the tall growth around the stock tank and the shady, overgrown edge of the near pasture where the cattle liked to stand out the heat of the day. From first gray light they were out, heads down, quick and tireless, snapping ticks and grasshoppers and beetles off the grass and the ground, patrolling every foot of the place in a moving line, and screaming, always screaming. At the hawk and the leaf and the truck on the road, the endless metallic two-note racket that the valley heard as noise, and that Marian, if you had asked her, would have told you was the sound of work being done. There was a craft to holding a flock that big to the ground, and Marian learned it that summer the way she learned everything, by doing it wrong once and not twice. A guinea is a half-wild bird by nature, closer to its African grandmother than a barnyard hen will ever be, and a flock turned loose careless will simply drift. Up the coulee and over the ridge and gone, roosting in the cottonwoods and belonging to no one. So through the first weeks she fed them a little scratch at dusk in the near yard, the same call every evening, teaching 84 birds that home was the place the cracked corn was, and a coop rail was the place to roost when the light went, so that they ranged wide all the long day over every acre she needed, patrolled, and came drifting back at dark of their own accord, screaming to be counted onto the roost. She counted them every night. It became a thing she did the way another woman might say her prayers, standing at the coop in the last of the light while the birds came in 2s and 3s off the darkening field, counting the gray shapes up onto the rail, a habit that would matter more than she knew before the summer was out, because a woman who counts her flock every night is a woman who knows, to the bird, that the ground is being covered. She watched them work, too, in the evenings, the way some people watch weather. She would stand at the fence with the day's heat going out of the ground and follow the moving line of them across the near pasture, the flock bristling and quick, heads down, and she could see, if you knew to look, the pattern of it. How they favored the fence rows and the brush and the damp tick holding grass and left the short-grazed open ground alone, working exactly the worst of it, the very edges and shadows where a tick climbs up to wait on a passing leg. She had a neighbor's calf she'd taken in to doctor that summer, a bull calf gone lame, and she kept it close in the near pasture where the birds worked heaviest, and where every other calf in the valley by August wore ticks in its ears and along its brisket and up the tender skin of its bag. That calf stayed clean as a whistle the whole time it was down. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell who would have heard it. but she saw it, and she filed it away with 6 years of the same. And she went on holding her screaming army to the ground while the valley laughed and drenched their cattle and waited, though none of them knew they were waiting, for the thing that was already breeding up thick in all their tall and tick-blessed grass. For she had come, over the years, to hear the screaming differently than the rest of the valley did. To Dell Rourke and the men at the counter, the guinea racket was simply the worst thing about an already worthless bird, an insult carried half a mile on the wind. But Marian had learned to read it. She knew that a flock screaming steady over in the coulee brush meant they were working the worst of the tick ground. She knew that a sudden hard chorus of it meant a hawk was over, or a coyote was moving the fence line, or a stranger's truck had turned in off the road, and that her birds would give her that warning a full minute before she'd have known any other way. The sound the whole county mocked her for was, to her ear, at once a work song and a watch bell, the plain audible proof that 84 tireless little sentries were out patrolling every acre she owned. She had stopped hearing it as noise a long time ago. She heard it as safety. And by the end of that terrible summer, so would they. The land answered the way worked ground answers. By high summer the Hollis quarter section was, though hardly a soul in the valley had seen it up close to know, the cleanest tick range in that whole end of the county. Marian could walk her fence rows in the tall of the grass and come back with nothing on her, could run her hand down a calf's leg at the tank and find its hide clean, could sit in the shade of her own brush where any other man's brush would have left her picking ticks off for an hour. Where 6 dozen guineas patrolled dawn to dark, the ticks simply could not breed up and hold. They were eaten as fast as they hatched, stripped off the grass before they could ever climb high enough to catch onto a passing leg, and the ground the valley had written off as a shrieking widow's folly had quietly become, that summer, the 1 square mile of the Coldwater Valley where a body could not have found a tick if she'd hunted for one. And the rest of the valley that same summer was doing the opposite. It had been a wet spring behind a mild winter, the kind of year the old-timers warned bred ticks up thick. And up on the good bench ground and along the river bottoms and through all the tall, ungrazed grass of the well-run ranches, the ticks bred up thick indeed. Dell Rourke's cattle carried them. The Ferris place carried them. The families along the county road pulled them off their dogs and off their own ankles and off the children who came in from playing in the tall grass along the ditches. And they cursed the wet spring and thought no more about it, the way people do about a thing that has always been a nuisance and never yet been worse. They drenched their cattle and dusted their dogs and did not, any of them, keep a single guinea hen. The ticks were only ticks. Everyone knew a tick was a nuisance and nothing more. That was the summer the valley learned different. It came first to the cattle, the way these things do, and it came quietly, so that for a week or two no one strung it together. A cow off her feed on the Ferris place, 2 calves down on the river bottom with a high fever and a staggering gait, and then dead before the vet could get out. A steer of Dell Rourke's found stiff in the tall grass of the far pasture with no mark on him a man could see. The vet drove the valley with his jaw set, and he told them what he was afraid it was, and the word he used was one the valley had heard before and never truly feared: tick fever. Rocky Mountain spotted fever carried in the bite of the wood ticks that had bred up thick that wet year in all the grass the valley had let stand, and it was in the cattle now. And a tick that had fed on a sick beast was a tick that could carry it up a child's sock next, and then it was in the people. It came to a household on the river bottom first, one of the families the story does not name. A young one down with a tick bite nobody had thought twice about, and 3 days later a fever that climbed and a rash that crept up from the wrists and the ankles. And the doctor 40 miles off in the county seat saying the word spotted fever over the telephone in a voice that made the whole valley go cold at once. Then a hired man on the bench laid up shaking under blankets in the August heat. Then a woman on the Ferris place. Word of it ran the valley faster than any laughter ever had, house to house along the party line. And the sound of it was different from any sound the valley had made all summer, because a man may laugh at a bird and a man may curse a tick, but there is no laughing left in a house where the fever has come and the doctor is 40 miles away and the nearest hospital farther than that. The fear changed the way the valley moved. Mothers who had turned their children loose all their lives to run the ditches and the tall grass and the shady coulees kept them to the mown yard now, and did not let them pass the fence, and went over them at night by lamplight for the small dark thing that could carry death up a pant leg. Men who had drenched their cattle for the flies and the grubs drenched them now with a cold new attention, and burned their fence rows and mowed their ditches raw, and still could not be sure, because the ticks were in the deer and the grass and the brush of a whole valley, and a man cannot burn a whole valley. They dusted the dogs and checked the horses and lay awake. And the tall, rich grass that had always been the pride of a well-watered ranch, the deep, ungrazed growth along the river and up the good bench draws, became, that August, a thing to be afraid of, because they understood at last that every acre of it was breeding the very danger that had come into their houses. The valley had spent a laughing summer, certain it knew what was worth having and what was worthless. It was learning, in the worst way there is, that it had had the whole thing backward. The county sent out a man from the health department, and the man from the health department stood on the co-op scale and told a crowd of frightened ranchers what by then they had already begun, with a dawning horror to understand that the fever was in the ticks, and the ticks were in the grass, and the grass was everywhere they lived and worked and turned their families out to be, and that until the tick load came down there was no ground in the Coldwater Valley a body could call safe. He told them to mow and to burn and to dust and to check themselves morning and night. And a man in the crowd asked him, in the flat, hopeless voice of a man who already knows the answer, whether there was anything on God's earth that would actually clear the ticks off a place and keep it clear. And the health man spread his hands and said that short of poisoning the whole range there was no quick way he knew, that the tick would always come back off the deer and the brush, and that they would simply have to get through the season careful and pray for an early frost. There was no ground in that valley, he said, a body could call safe. No ground, that is, but one, though the health department man did not know it, and it would fall to an old foreman with a tick jar to say so. It was Dell Rourke's own foreman, a leathery old hand named Pete Vasquez, who had worked the valley 40 years and forgotten more range than most men learn, who said it first, and he said it standing at the co-op with a tick jar in his hand and his hat pushed back. He said he'd been down along the Hollis fence line the day before, run a stray calf back, and that he'd walked the widow's ground a good hour in the tall grass, and that he had not brought a single tick off it, not one, off ground dat thin and dat brushy, in a year like this one, and clean as a swept floor. The men around him went quiet. And Pete Vasquez, who was too old and too tired to care much for the feed store laughter, said the thing none of the rest of them had let themselves think yet. He said, "It's them birds. It's them screaming birds of hers. They've been eating the ticks off that ground all summer while we drenched cattle and cursed the weather, and hers is the only clean ground in this valley, and every one of us laughed at her for it." No one laughed then. There is a particular silence that falls on a crowd of proud men when they understand, all at once, that the person they have been mocking was right. And it fell on the co-op scale that afternoon, and it did not lift. They stood there with their tick jars and their sick cattle and their frightened families at home, and they understood that the widow Hollis, whom they had counted a fool, had spent the whole laughing summer doing the one thing that would have kept them all safe, and that not a man among them had troubled once to ask her why. Some of them, standing there, would have been remembering their own words, the heifer she should have bought, the screaming rats, the farm a person got when she deserved it, and finding those words gone suddenly bitter in the mouth. It is one thing to be wrong. It is another to have laughed at the one who was right while your own house filled with fear, and there is no man harder on a proud man in that moment than himself. They stood in the long silence, and they did the sum of it, every one of them, and not a word was said that a person would want to remember. Dell Rourke said nothing at all. He stood a while at the edge of the crowd with his jaw working, a big, proud man who had run the valley's opinions for 30 years and had just heard his own foreman name him, in front of everyone, the loudest of the fools. Then he got in his truck and he drove, and where he drove, though it cost him more than he could have said to do it, was down off his good bench ground to the low end of the valley, to the thin, brush-crept quarter section where the screaming carried on the wind, to the fence of the woman he had offered to buy out twice and mocked a dozen times, to ask her, hat in his hands, for help. Marian was in the near pasture when his truck turned in, and she heard the birds tell her he was coming before she saw the dust. The hard, sudden chorus of them going up along the road as they always did for a stranger's truck, and she stood and waited by the fence with the feed scoop still in her hand. Dell Rourke got out slow. He was a big man and a proud one, and he did not have the first idea how to do what he had come to do, and he stood at her fence a long moment looking out over her clean tick-scoured ground with the gray birds working it in the low gold light, and at last he took off his hat, which the valley had never once seen Dell Rourke do at a fence, and he said he reckoned she'd heard about the fever. Marian said she had. He said Pete allowed her ground was clean of ticks. She said it was. It had been all summer. And Dell Rourke looked at his hat in his hands, and he said, in a voice gone low and rough, that he'd been wrong about her birds, and that he was sorry for the way he'd talked, and that he had grandchildren coming to the ranch in 2 weeks, and no safe grass to turn them out on. And could she tell him how a man went about getting guineas of his own onto his ground? Before then, she did not gloat. That was the thing the valley would remember about Marian Hollis long after the fever summer had passed into an old story told at the co-op, that when the turning came, and it came all the way, she took not 1 ounce of pleasure in it. She had every right in the world to stand at that fence and let Dell Rourke feel the full weight of every word he had ever said at that counter, and she did not. She looked at the big proud man turning his hat in his hands, and she thought, if she thought anything, of grandchildren in the tall grass, and she said only that Keats took a while to raise up, but that she had birds enough to spare some starter breeders now, and eggs in the incubator besides, and that she'd help him get a flock going and show him how to hold them to the ground, and that he'd want to fence the worst of the brush first. She named him a fair price for the breeders, the same she'd have named anyone, and not a dollar of grudge in it. And Dell Rourke, who had told the whole feed store to ring her flock and buy a heifer, stood at the widow's fence and thanked her and meant it, and drove home with 24 screaming gray birds in slat crates in the back of his truck. He was the first, and then they came. The Ferris family came with a boy still weak from the fever, and Marian gave them a starter flock and would not take money for it, not from a house with a sick child in it. The families off the river bottom came. The old hand Pete Vasquez came on his own account, embarrassed and grinning, and said he'd wanted guineas for 30 years and been too proud, and Marian gave him a setting of eggs and told him he was a fool for waiting. And it was the closest thing to a joke the valley ever heard her make. Through the rest of that terrible summer and into the fall, the trucks came down the county road to the low end of the valley one after another, to the fence of the woman they had laughed at, to buy her Keats and her breeders and her hard-won advice, and to turn their own frightened children out at last onto the one clean ground for miles, her ground. The tick-scoured quarter section that 84 screaming birds had kept safe while the whole valley laughed. She sold what she could sell and gave away what needed giving, and she showed every one of them the same thing, patient and plain, how to hold a flock to the ground, how to fence the brush, how to read the screaming for the watch bell it was. She had been the most laughed at woman in the county in June. By October, she was the reason half its children were safe. The fever passed, the way these things pass, when the frost came and killed the grass and knocked the ticks down for the year, and the valley counted itself lucky it had not been worse. A boy on the river bottom had come near to dying and had lived. A calf crop had been hurt. It could have been far worse, and everyone knew, without much wanting to say it, the one place it had not touched at all. And why? And in the years that followed, a strange and quiet thing settled over the Coldwater Valley. It became, of all the unlikely things, Guinea country. The screaming that had once carried half a mile as an insult now carried from a dozen places at once, from the bench ground and the river bottom and the Ferris place and Dell Rourke's own home pasture. The two note racket rising from ranch after ranch across the valley, and no one laughed at it any more. They had learned, the hard way, to hear it the way Marian had always heard it, not as noise, but as work being done, and as safety, and as an alarm bell against a thing they now knew could climb a child's sock and kill. Marian Hollis never once threw it back at them, and that, in the end, was what made the valley take her in the way it had never taken a widow alone before. She could have. She had sat at that feed store and taken their laughter for a whole long summer, and when the turning came, she could have collected on every word of it, and she never did. She sold Dell Rourke his Keats fare and gave the sick families theirs for nothing, and taught anyone who asked, and she never said, not once, that she had told him so. Because she had not told him so, she had simply known and worked, and let the ground and the birds and the terrible summer say it for her. When a young couple new to the valley asked her, a year on, why she'd kept those birds when the whole county laughed, she only said that she'd watched them clean her ground of ticks for 6 years before ever a soul got sick, and that a thing you have seen with your own eyes for 6 years is worth more than a room full of men who are sure. And then she went back to her fencing, because the fever was gone, but the ticks would be back next wet year. And the bird still had to be held to the ground, and a woman who has been proven right does not get to skip the afternoon's work any more than a woman who has been laughed at does. They had said her birds were worthless in the dry summer of 1976, and in a way they were right. Worthless for the table, worthless for the market, worth almost nothing the way a man counts the worth of a thing. What Marian Hollis had understood, that none of them had troubled to ask, was that the worth of a guinea hen was never in the meat or the egg. It was in the work and the watch, and the endless screaming patrol of 84 little sentries stripping a danger off the ground before it could ever rise up and reach a child. A worth that did not show at the co-op scale and could not be laughed at once you had seen what its absence cost. The loudest, ugliest, most inconvenient thing on her whole place had turned out to be the thing that saved the valley, and she had known it all along, and she had never needed them to know it, only to be safe. As the old man Elias Redbird had told her husband years before, on this same ground, the thing that screams the loudest is not always the useless thing. Sometimes it is the only one on the whole place that is paying attention. If this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who's been told that what they have isn't worth keeping. Drop your city in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, ask yourself this: how many of the loud, ugly, inconvenient things we are all so quick to be rid of are the very things quietly keeping us safe?